this module is all about habits. And we can't stress enough the importance of habits. It's estimated that between 40 to even maybe 50% of what it is that we do, think, and feel in a day is actually habitual. So if so much of what we do in a day is habitual, i.e. automatic, sometimes almost unconscious, how important then does it become to really understand what your habits are? To take an inventory of the habits that are positive, i.e. that they are bringing you in the direction that you want to go, that they are in line with your goals for yourself and the kind of person that you want to become. And to make sure that we can have some kind of a control over changing the habits that are doing the contrary, that are stopping us from being successful and succeeding at what we want to do. So habits are candy for your brain. Habits are important for your brain because they help the brain be more efficient. A habit is a pattern. It's a pattern of behavior, it's a pattern of thinking, and it's a pattern of feeling. And your brain is a pattern maker. Your brain is a pattern lover. It loves patterns for a really simple reason. Once you understand the pattern, then it doesn't take a whole lot of effort to get that thing to work. Patterns are time savers. They are automatic and energy efficient brain power. So that's the importance of habits, and that's what we're going to look at today. So let's start with a philosopher. This time we're looking at Aristotle, who very famously said, or at least this is attributed to him, we are what we repeatedly do. What you think every day, what you feel every day, what you say, how you act every day, eventually becomes who you are. So if this is true, then your habits then are the gateway to your future self. Ask yourself, well, who do you want to become? The ancient philosophers saw habits as things, tools that we could use to design the kind of future that we wanted to have for ourselves. So whether the habits are good, bad, or neutral, they're important to understand because they are the tools that we can use to shape our future. Aristotle spoke of normative and descriptive laws. Don't get hung up on the word laws. Basically, just what he meant to say was when we talk about something that's normative, we are talking about who we would like to be, how we would like things to be, what we should do, what we ought to do, the kind of person we want to become. Or if we're talking about a society, the kind of society that we are aiming at as a goal, that we ought to be that way. And the descriptive laws were just saying how things actually were. So Aristotle's genius, so many thousands of years ago, was to see the habit as the bridge between who we actually are right now and who we ought to become, who we should become. So Aristotle would say, if you want to be brave, act bravely, and then you will become brave. So we learn by doing. And practice automizes behavior. When you do something over and over and over again, it becomes automatic. So this might be pretty obvious for you, but remember, this is Aristotle way before psychology was ever a science. And actually, the ancient philosophers were really, in a sense, the first psychologists. So Aristotle's simple advice, it's not enough to appeal to the rationality, to the mind. You have to appeal to the will. Why? Because the will is where the emotions live. We know that this is a modern saying, motivation is emotion in action. Think of it. When you really, really want something, when you're really motivated to get something done, there's movement, there's change. That's motivation. So emotions can create the changes in your physical body state. That's where you're going to be structuring your experience or designing your habits to create the kind of future that you want. Interesting that Aristotle also understood the importance of early behavior in early childhood that shapes behavior later on. And he also had some really interesting things to say about how our society is structured and the importance of parenting and family for the adult that we become later on in life. So early habits early in life going to help that adult be more successful, because remember that the habits are those automatic processes. I really like the way Aristotle spoke about us being the designer of our future life. So structure your experience in such a way as you have the opportunity to practice what it is that's important to you. So he would say, if you want to be a kind person, then act in a kind way. And if you do that repeatedly, well, that's who you're going to become. So well before his time, he was actually describing cognitive behavioral therapy, or at least some techniques of cognitive behavioral therapy. Let's take a look at the anatomy of a habit. So a habit, then, here's a definition, is a learned behavior that's done automatically without awareness, almost unconsciously. It's well entrenched. In other words, it's just like the grooves of the skis that on this skier here. It is well entrenched. It is well established. You don't really need to think about it. It just sort of goes of its own accord. We also have a routine, which is a kind of a habit, but it's a habit with a little bit more awareness. So when we speak of a routine, something that we do often, we don't have to think too much about it. But a habit is something that is so ingrained that it's almost unconscious. If you look at this skier here and compare that, the energy level that this person here needs to expend to create this path versus this person here who's already on the path. This is the analogy that I'd like to use so that you can understand that in this scenario here, when you're learning something new, your brain is expending huge amounts of energy, which is why your brain prefers this, because it's already learned, it's already done. And so when you want to create a new behavior, act in a new way, think and feel in a new way, you need to create a new neurological circuit. That's what this fellow here is doing. Well, actually, he's skiing, but follow the metaphor here. So to create that new circuit, the first time you do that, or the second or the third or the fourth time, it's a lot of hard work. And the repeated practice, as Aristotle said, is the key, because eventually that circuit will run of its own accord and you will have had the habit established. This is just an interesting study about how when we learn, our brain changes. So here you have a cabbie, the famous London cabbies, who are, in this study anyways, discovered that they had hippocampi, that's the plural for hippocampus, remember that's where your memories are made, that were much larger than the normal average person, certainly much larger than the bus driver, because the bus driver habitually takes the same route. That's the habit. But the cabbie took a different route every day depending on what the customer is asking him. So your brain is going to respond to the new learning. You read in your textbook, chapter 2.3, about classical conditioning, and I'd just like to review that here a little bit just to make sure that you really understand, because a habit is a learned behavior. And there are lots of different ways that we can learn behavior, and this is one example. So when we have a classical conditioning situation, we have two stimuli that are being paired together. And in this example, in box number 1, the first stimuli is a visual stimuli. Well, maybe olfactory too, because probably the dog is also smelling the food, but the dog sees, smells the food, and salivates. That first example there, this stimuli is what we call an unconditioned response. Why? Because it's a natural reflective behavior for the dog to salivate. It's not anything that he has to work hard at. It's not anything that he has to learn. It's a natural reflex. So the response of the dog, the salivation, is unconditioned just because it's natural. It's not something he had to learn. In the second box, you see that the stimulus, the bell, is now going to be paired, look at the third box, with the presentation of the food, at which point the dog will salivate. In the third box, you see the dog is salivating not because of the bell. He's salivating because the food is there. But if you present the bell and the food, those are the two stimuli you're going to pair together, often enough, eventually you will not need the food for the dog to salivate. The response will come with the bell. So what do these words mean? Unconditioned response means a behavior or a response that's just a reflex. It's not learned. It's something natural. The conditioned response now means it's been learned. That's all that means. So the bell, the stimulus, until it is associated in the mind of the dog with the food, is what we call neutral. It doesn't mean anything to the dog. It's just a bell. But you put that bell often enough with the presentation of the food, and then the bell now will signify that food is coming. So that's the classical conditioning that you read in the book. So here I'm going to go through this again a little bit because I like this visual a lot. So classical conditioning in any learning, when we learn, we alter the way we see our environment, and therefore we change the way we understand or interpret the stimuli coming into us. When we change the way that we evaluate or understand the stimuli, whether it be a sound, a feeling, an event, whatever, we will therefore change the way that we behave. So again, very quickly, here's this little dog. He sees food. That's an unconditioned response because it's totally natural. Ring that bell, present the food with the bell. It's still at this point an unconditioned response because that bell needs to be presented with that food over and over and over again so that those two stimuli are paired. And when they are paired, you don't even need the food. Ring the bell and that dog will salivate. So how can we understand classical conditioning in our lives every day? It's simple. When your phone vibrates because you're in class and you're not supposed to have the ringer on, and you know that you have something incoming, well, you've responded. You've responded at least, well, hopefully you haven't responded because you're not supposed to be responding. But let's say that you're not in class. You get the ping of an incoming message. You get the ding of something coming in on your phone. You have learned that those things mean that you've got a communication, and you're going to, most of the time, you're going to respond. So there's a really simple example of how we can see classical conditioning in everyday life. So it's a stimulus and a response behavior. Now, operant conditioning you also saw in your book, and it is different. Operant conditioning is with a voluntary behavior as opposed to a natural and a reflexive behavior. So let's take a look at this. We have behaviors that we would like more than other behaviors. Let's say the desired behavior in this example, get our homework done before the deadline, get more exercise in a day, and get lots of good sleep. Undesirable behaviors or behaviors we would want to decrease or extinguish: procrastination, not getting enough exercise, not getting enough sleep. So how do we reinforce a behavior so that it will happen more often than not? We call this increasing behavior. Well, there are two ways. Take a look at this slide. There are two ways to increase a behavior. You can positively reinforce that behavior, or you can negatively reinforce that behavior. So the positive reinforcement of a behavior is probably the easiest one to understand. And here in the slide, the example, and I think this is from the book, the example is giving a dog a treat when you train them to sit. So you say, sit down, Rover. Rover doesn't sit. You push his little butt down. He sits. Oh, good boy. And then you give him a treat. You keep on repeating that. Eventually, you won't have to tap on his behind so that he sits. He will sit automatically because he's getting the treat. So you are pairing the positive reinforcement with the behavior that you want. the dog will respond. A negative reinforcement doesn't mean something bad. It just means that, and it's still, a negative reinforcement is always about increasing behavior. So negative reinforcement means that we are removing something. Positive reinforcement, you are adding something. Negative reinforcement, you're removing something. Teacher wants the student to learn how to put their hand up when they want to make a comment or ask a question. A positive reinforcement, say, for example, would be when the hands come up, the teacher would praise the student for being respectful of others and following the rules and all the rest of that. Praise is the positive reinforcement. A negative reinforcement. In your book, it spoke about a boy who had to take the garbage out and wasn't getting his work done, wasn't taking the garbage out. The parents were nagging. So the removal of the thing that is unpleasant is the negative reinforcement. And it's only called negative because we're removing something. So positive you add, negative you remove. What's being removed in the example that the book used? The nagging. So the nagging stops. Oh my God, finally, that's something that has been removed. Okay. Let's just jump to the next slide because I think this illustrates it a little bit better. So negative reinforcement means removing something that is unpleasant. We say it's aversive, an aversive stimulus, so that that behavior will increase in frequency. And an example, this will really help you remember. So our poor lady here is absolutely sunburned to a crisp. She didn't put on her sunblock. She didn't put on her, suntan cream. So, or she didn't have enough protection. So to make sure that never happens again, now I am going to put my suntan lotion on. So I am increasing the chance that the behavior of protecting my skin will happen because I want to avoid the painful sunburn. Another example, Montreal traffic, gotta love it. If I want to make sure that I'm not stuck in early morning traffic, I'm going to leave earlier so that I can avoid the traffic jam. So I am trying to avoid something that is negative. A punishment is not negative reinforcement. A punishment is when we have a behavior that we want to decrease. And we're going to decrease that behavior by adding an aversive stimuli. So adding something that is not pleasant. The example here I'm thinking of is a parking ticket. So if the City of Montreal doesn't want its citizens to park in this particular zone, when they do, we are trying to decrease that behavior by giving them a ticket. Or for another example, the child, the teenager doesn't observe the curfew of the parents. Well, they are, and the parents want to decrease that behavior of coming in late. Well, you are going, the aversive stimuli is going to be something that you lose. You're going to lose your freedom for a week if you're grounded. So we're removing something positive or adding something negative. That's a punishment. The whole idea of the punishment is to decrease a negative behavior that is not desirable. So think about this. What are all the ways that you try to avoid aversive stimuli? What would you maybe do to avoid getting a reprimand or avoid going to detention? That's an example. So what then are the most important differences or the essential differences between classical conditioning and operant conditioning? So in classical conditioning, you are pairing two stimuli. It's an association between a stimulus and a response. And it generally involves some kind of a behavior that is automatic or involuntary. And operant conditioning, the behavior is voluntary. In other words, I have to respond or choose to respond in a particular way. It's not like an automatic kind of a reflex. So operant behavior is based on voluntary behavior, and it uses reinforcements, positive reinforcements and negative reinforcements. both of those things are designed to make sure that the behavior repeats more often. We want more of that behavior. And the punishment then is to make sure that that behavior is decreased. So the question now becomes, can you condition yourself? We know that we're conditioned by our world. We're conditioned in so many different ways, either classically or operant conditioning. But can you condition yourself? Can we take an inventory of our behaviors, look at them and say, this one I like, this one's got to go, and can we apply this in our lives? Well, yes, of course. It means you need to be aware. You need to understand what your patterns of behavior are. I don't know if you know Tony Robbins. This is a great quote from him. Tony Robbins has made millions of dollars motivating people to change their lives and to change their behavior. And he says, if you can learn to condition yourself, you can change anything you want in your life. That's really the secret. So now we come to Charles Duhigg's The Power of Habit. You are going to see him a little bit later on in this module in his TED Talk. He calls them habit loops, and he talks about cues or triggers. Follow that cycle. In the middle, you've got the routine, the thing that you do, or the thing that you think, or the thing that you feel, because habits are all of those things. And then the reward that we get at the end. That reward then becomes associated with the cue. So you can see that the why it's important for you to understand classical conditioning and operant conditioning, because really now when we're talking about the important work of changing your habits, Charles Duhigg says, really what you need to understand is you need to understand what are your triggers. So what are those cues that you respond to, like the ding on the phone? And if you wanted to change that habit after reading the book, this is a great book, I recommend it to anybody, you understand that you need to identify the cue, understand why you're doing it, that's the reward, and change the routine, the behavior in the middle. Let's go to the next slide so you can understand perhaps a little bit better. The Army, as we know, and you saw that with the Navy SEALs, but in basic training in boot camp, okay, drills habits into soldiers, how to shoot, how to think, how to communicate under fire. So this is a quote from this book. So on the battlefield, every command that's issued draws behaviors practiced to the point of automation. The entire organization relies on endlessly rehearsed routines. So this is a quote from an Army major that Charles Duhigg interviewed, and he discovered that habits are the key to training the good soldier. It's just got to be completely automatic. He also discovered when he was stationed in Iran that habits are not just what individuals have, but they are also what groups of people have. Collectively, we have habits. And in the book, he tells the story of how he discovered that to minimize the risk of riots breaking out, this Army major discovered that if they removed the food vendors from the plaza, then people would leave. And riots were much less likely to break out. Why? Because there was a habit, a collective habit established around the eating of the food, and then this kind of explosive behavior. So I really think that this is an absolutely fabulous idea, that habits are not just for individuals, but they're also for communities. Think of all the ways that in school we might have habits that we engage in collectively. Charles Duhigg talks about the habit loop. You have a cue, that's a trigger. You have a routine, that's the thing that you do. And why do we do it? We do it for the reward. When we want to change a habit, he says, what you need to do is you need to find out what the trigger is, the cue, understand why you're doing it, and then put in a different routine. Keep the cue, keep the reward, but just add a different routine. So, for example, somebody's trying to stop smoking. The cue would be, ask yourself, well, when are those moments in the day when I smoke? This is perhaps not a good example because I'm assuming none of you smoke. But let's just continue with the example. Well, I smoke when I'm stressed. Okay, so the stress is the cue. The routine is the habit that you do, is the actual smoking of the cigarette. The reward is the release of stress and tension from the smoking of the cigarette, which actually doesn't come from the nicotine as much as it comes from the fact that you take in a deep breath. So to change the habit, understand what the cue is, understand what the reward is. The reward is I want relief from the stress. The habit is the actual cigarette smoking. So take out the cigarette, put something else in its place. Cue, I'm stressed. Routine, put on my shoes, go for a walk. Reward, relief from the stress. So the cue and the reward remain, and you change the routine. So there was a study done on mice. They put them in a maze. There was a piece of chocolate at the end of the maze. When they first put the mice in the maze, well, they don't move very quickly and they sort of sniff and scratch and it takes them a long time to get anywhere. But by the time they get to the end of the maze and they realize that there's chocolate there, then the next time they're put in the maze, well, they might move a little bit faster. And so as the route through the maze becomes more automatic, what the researchers discovered, because they had, sounds a little cruel, but they had sensors embedded in the brains of these poor little mice and rats. When the sensors indicated that the rat was thinking very, very hard was at the beginning of the maze when he was just learning to navigate the maze. When the rat or the mouse had learned the maze, then what the sensors showed in terms of activity in the brain was almost like the brain was going to sleep. It had learned it, and so it didn't have to work that hard. The part of the brain that recalls patterns is called the basal ganglia. And it's important because it stores all of the actions that we do repeatedly so that the rest of the brain can work less. The important thing about changing habits, as I just said earlier, is understanding that you have a trigger. And your trigger might be something physical, it might be something emotional, it might even be a thought. And then there's the routine that is causing the problem for you, or maybe it's not a problem, maybe it's a good thing. And then there is the reward. So without understanding the cue and the reward, you're not going to be able to change any of your habits. So in this habit loop, each habit has a cue, and that cue or that trigger might be a time, might be connected to a place, it might be connected to an emotion or a person or something that you repeatedly do, the routine that you do, and then the reward, which is generally very pleasant, or there's some kind of satisfaction. Let's take the example of a gym routine. All right. So if you like to work out, you have your cue. Let's say your cue is you work out at the end of the day, or you work out at the beginning of the day. So the alarm goes off, you've got your running shoes and your workout clothes there, you jump into your clothes, off to the gym. The routine is the actual physical exercise, and the reward is how amazing you feel after you've had a really good workout. Eventually, the reward and the cue are paired together, and it creates the cravings. So you need to go to the gym. You need to work out. You need that physical exercise. That's when the cravings appear. So for you guys to learn how to get rid of habits that are not helping you and develop habits that are going to help you, you need to look at the cues and the rewards. What are you really going for? What are you really getting? What is the payoff? What is the reward that is so important to you? Look at the triggers, because if you understand what the triggers are, then you can have a plan. When that trigger happens, instead of doing X, I'm going to do Y. When I feel that anxiety coming, instead of grabbing a cigarette, I'm going to put my shoes on and go for a walk, and then I get my reward. So just to finish up with Aristotle, if we are what we repeatedly do, then excellence is not something that you do once. It's something that you do habitually. It's something that you do every day, something that you strive for every day. Think about that.